Welcome back. This is going to be the second part of the training that we started on this whole notion of the animal or base versus the celestial. And I'm going to use something that I haven't used before in a training with you, and that is just my good old trusty Samsung tablet. So I'm going to go ahead and draw on it. You're going to get a little chicken scratch from me today. And the reason for that is because I just really haven't been able to get a graphic that I like down in PowerPoint or anything else that's as fluid as I think I really want to be able to talk about this today. So let's take a look at this image. And in it, you can see that there are basically 4 layers to this. Now, it's very important to note that this is just a representation for the purposes of talking about it today. This isn't a model that I'm presenting. I'm not saying that there's 4 layers and, that this is like the layers that are the layers of fundamental well-being, but different and kind of outside of it or anything like that, right? I think it's just easier to see a sort of visual, spatial type of diagram as we talk about this and go over it. Okay, so let's go back to it here. At the very top, you can see that's where the ego is situated in the 4th level of this diagram. In the 3rd level, that's where you find the fundamental well-being matrix. In the 2nd level, that's the animal to celestial gradient, basically. So that lives at that layer. And then level 1 is really what is underneath that sort of, if you were to go below the animal level of perception or the celestial level of perception, you could get one rung down lower than that, then you would be at this other level of perception. In other words, it's what perceives that level, essentially, what immediately precedes that level. And what, as a, another way of thinking about that is it could be like a flashlight, basically, shining through the 2nd level to the 3rd level. In terms of consciousness. Okay, but let's keep this simple for now. One of the things that I want you to think about is that there is essentially here a vertical. So if we go to the full left side, all the way to the left side, there's basically a vertical here. And it starts with the animalistic, goes up through the fundamental well-being matrix and to the ego. Now, the reason I'm drawing that column like that is because there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of neuroscience, psychology, biological, you name it, type of evidence for the aspects of this animal sort of level of things, this animal nature, this base nature that we talked about on the other video, forming key portions and key parts of the ego. And so there's a direct relationship here on the far left side from this animalistic layer up to the ego layer. Now, what about when you come down to fundamental well-being? Well, this same animalistic layer can basically go across the entire fundamental well-being matrix, and in fact, it can even go further. It can go sort of pre-fundamental well-being. Obviously, you're operating from this level from the ego, right? And so it's one of those things that can be pervasive. You can go very, very far in fundamental well-being, as far as we know, pretty much as far as we've researched, and still be in that animalistic side of things, that base side of things. I know it might sound very surprising. It might seem like, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't that be the celestial or whatever? And the celestial certainly has some tendencies that are more like later locations, and in fact, they might make it easier to get to especially far out locations. But nonetheless, the animalistic side of things, or the base side of things, can do that as well. It can make it to, as far as we know, every place that we've researched in fundamental well-being. And of course, it's there pre-fundamental well-being. All right, so then the next thing that we have here is the celestial level. So the celestial level can do basically the same thing. It can go across this whole matrix, and it can go into pre-PNSE. So it can go and also into what you would think of as kind of this level up here. And that's what I'm representing here. If you were to have been, born and very young, switched into the celestial layer, but not switched into it from a PNSE standpoint, you could very easily find yourself in a similar type of situation to the ego side of the fence. And that's what I've drawn a question here. I don't really know what we would call that. Maybe we would call that the celestial ego or something like that, right? There really isn't a term for it, hasn't traditionally been a term for it. There are people who want to call that enlightened or awakened or whatever else, but it's a different thing, really. It's the experience of that celestial stuff that we were talking about, those qualities of that celestial experience that we talked about in the last video. But up here at this level, up here at the level basically of the separate self, of the ego, if you will. And then there's that gradient basically between here, right? And so you've got this gradient where someone can have more on the egoic side, less on the celestial side, but still be experiencing some of both. Maybe they just have temporary celestial experiences, or maybe the celestial is 90%, but there's still 10% of what we might consider the narrative self in there, and so on, right? And so there's a big, big range of experiences here in this gradient between the ego and whatever we really sort of want to call this. We could perhaps call this the celestial ego, just to distinguish it. Okay, so you can come in, and most people do, on the far left side of this with a very strong narrative self developing, a very strong ego developing. And if if you're familiar with sort of the parapsychology stuff around children or some of the more interesting studies of kids, you know that kids, it seems like, have some celestial access many times by default prior to their really locking in the ego as the pure sort of ultimate final arbiter of what their sense of self is going to be. And of course, culture and society and all of that really, really helps with that. We also think that hormones help with that. You can see it happening at sort of punctuated periods that correspond to developmental cycles and hormones and things like that. And so even we think when someone is young, there is some natural sort of fluidity. It's not like we just come in and we are egoic and we are sort of based in the narrative self and that's it. Quite the opposite. But over time, we really do lock in more and more on the narrative self side because that's just what culture and society, and to a lesser degree hormones, kind of does for us. Okay, so that's not the only possible scenario though, right? Because you can also come in on the far right of this. And, there are people, in fact, there was someone in the call, Anna Meek, who's, of course, a key member of our staff, runs a lot of our programs and stuff like that. She, for as long as she can remember, has basically been in fundamental well-being and in the celestial form of fundamental well-being. So she would really correspond to this over here. Now, what's interesting about this, in her case, she would have started somewhere down here because she doesn't ever remember going through this stage with the celestial ego up there. Other people have participated in the research and did clearly remember that celestial ego stage. So in her case, she came in right in fundamental well-being, right down here, but from the celestial standpoint. Now, here's what's fascinating about all of this. There seem to be neurological tendencies that exist at these layers. And those neurological tendencies, and even we could say down to layer 2, and who knows from there, not part of today's conversation, When you are really, really locked in the narrative self, you can't imagine a fundamental well-being alternative to it, right? Even if you read about it and you study it and you become obsessed with it, nonetheless, let's face it, when you transition to fundamental well-being, it's not really matching a lot of what your mind probably thought that was going to be like, right? And so for most people that never even encounter the idea of fundamental well-being, they really live their life in a very fixed reality that is the traditional narrative self, ego, whatever we want to call it today, right? And they can't even begin to imagine anything beyond it. And as someone moves in the direction of PNSE, often that's terrifying for them. I mean, terrifying at sometimes existential levels, certainly not always existential levels, but it can feel, you know, like it brings up a lot of fear. A lot of people tiptoe right up to the line of transitioning and then back, and then again and back, and again and back, and they try to sort of work up. It can feel like you're trying to sort of work up the gumption to kind of push through. And like the more you push in, the more the fear can arise and stuff like that. And eventually you're like, oh, no, you know, I'm going to pull away from that, right? And so that is a pretty common experience from a fundamental well-being standpoint. I remember having that experience earlier in my life. For example, people have written whole books about, you know, the experience of that. The interesting thing is that same thing seems to also happen over here on this side of the fence. And so it's not exclusive to what we would think of as the normal narrative self. It can also happen from a celestial ego standpoint. It can also happen from anywhere in this gradient range as well. All right. Now, here's another interesting thing about this. This is not limited to that fourth level in our diagram. It's also the case that the same thing can happen down here at this level, whether you're on the animalistic side or the celestial side. Again, these are very deep forms of identity in your system, right? People typically have one or the other. The vast majority of people, of course, have the animalistic base side. And it's just like the ego in someone who has never had any glimpse beyond it and has never heard anybody talking about a possibility of what's beyond it. It's, you know, it forms your entire reality. It forms the basis of your entire reality. You can't imagine that there is anything other than it. It feels just like the totality of everything and so on. And it does that regardless of whether you're on the animalistic side or the celestial side of the fence. And breaking out of that can produce something that is very much like what you see up here at the fourth level, which is it can produce a lot of fear, terror, those same types of things that I mentioned. Massive amounts of confusion. You can just feel like you're getting more and more and more confused. You know, it can really space you out. It can make you sleep for long periods of time. It can just all of those things that any of us have ever heard about or are familiar with in terms of the transition up here at the top level in level 4 there. Those same things can happen down here again with this stuff at what we're calling level 2. Again, this is not really a hierarchy. Obviously, the ego doesn't necessarily sit on top of fundamental well-being. There's a brain rewiring that happens there. You could almost think of those as more lateral. So just keep in mind that this image is really just for our discussion purposes. All right. So one thing that's very interesting is that breaking free and seeing the celestial or seeing the animalistic, whichever one you've been locked into, it can be quite an ordeal. It can also not be much at all. You know, it can certainly just sort of flow, just happen from some method that you're doing or some releasing that you're doing or something like that, or it can just come out of the blue. But, you know, if you're not open to it, especially, it can really cause some, you know, psychological fear, even if someone is deep in fundamental well-being as surprising as that is, right? It can still disturb the system for sure. And all that. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out because if you think about what we're really talking about here, we're talking about very strong fixations of identity, right? So the ego, the celestial ego, the animalistic side, the celestial experience, these are all, if they've developed as sort of the core way that you see the world over a long period of time, especially, these can really root themselves in as deep parts of your fundamental identity, right? So your identity, for instance, might be egoic and animalistic, or it might be animalistic and some gradient between the ego and the celestial at the top layer, but primarily animalistic and a little bit celestial or something like that, right? And so you sort of cement in these identities in your system, and they can be very, very hard to break out of. And they can cause a lot of angst, a lot of dark night of the soul type of stuff, and so on. All right, so this is a good way to sort of visualize all of this. Now, one of the things that someone told me that I was talking to after the last presentation was that they felt that I was just like pro-celestial, right? And that I was basically saying everybody should experience the celestial, or the celestial is some sort of thing that is more advanced or better or whatever else. Remember how I started the last presentation, which was basically by saying, everybody's at a different spot. Everybody's going to get off at a different spot. Everybody's going to choose their spot, beyond which they're like, okay, that's just, too much further to go. And you even see this historically. I remember when I was in Assisi with some mystics and stuff, and I was getting the skinny on St. Francis. St. Francis died quite young. He really beat his body to death. He had a very ascetic, extreme view, or he had to suffer like Jesus and all of that. And it turns out that the immediate disciples around him, of course, he built a monastic system around him and all of that, but he had a core group, like everybody does. And it turns out that core group, they were like, okay, great, great, Francis, keep going, buddy. We're standing right here watching you, right? But they decided, there's kind of a line in the sand in their lives that they don't necessarily want to go beyond. So even in a situation like that, where you had one of the world's most famous great mystics as your direct mentor, right? People were like, I really am glad that I can bask in this glow as you keep going further out there, but yeah, I'm good here, right? So our message has always been, it's okay wherever you want to be. Whatever's right for you. You have to decide and figure out really what is right for you from the standpoint of fundamental well-being. You've got a whole life to live. You've got all kinds of responsibilities probably. You might be raising kids, could be job responsibilities, mortgage, whatever, right? You've got to do what is best for you. I am not sitting here saying, you got to go to the celestial place in this whole, perceptive system. And, this is where it's at. This is where you need to root yourself in. Far from it. However, let me just say that I do think that there is a significant benefit from breaking out of whichever of these categories that you're in. And so if you're stuck in the celestial, I think it does make sense to free yourself from the celestial. If you're stuck from the animalistic, I think it does make sense to free yourself from the animalistic. But that comes from one of sort of my own places of analysis around fundamental well-being, which is that one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of get maximum freedom and maximum flexibility in the system. And so from that perspective, you don't want a fixity in either one of these. If whichever one you're stuck in, or whatever combination of it you might be stuck in and have really sort of rooted into, it's, I think, a good idea to sort of break out of that so that you can see the boundaries of that, so that you can see the limitations of that, and you can get even more freedom, even more capability, even more capacity into your system. I also think it's the thing that allows one to get down to the first level, right? So it allows you to get down and get a glimpse of this first level in the diagram. You're not really ever able to perceive deeper levels accurately without achieving a certain amount of freedom at the level above them, right? And so something is perceiving, something even more fundamental is perceiving the celestial. Something even more fundamental is perceiving the animalistic, or the blend of them. What is that that is perceiving that? That, to me, is another degree of freedom in the system if you can gain access to it. And I'm always doing that type of thing, right? But again, that's the choice that I make on my side. And it doesn't have to be anything like the choice that you make for you. And so from the standpoint of the project, we don't really advocate anything specific around this. We just like to put out information like we're doing about this and let you make your own decisions and let you decide what's right for you. So let me just touch on a couple of other points that I was thinking, I'm not sure I made as well as I wanted to in the video the other day. So the first is that when we come down here to this gradient level, and we have the animalistic on one side, and we have the celestial on the other side, the celestial, if you can experience it, as I mentioned in the other training, seems to have the capability to do some really powerful purification of conditioning. Now, I suspect, I think we're many, many years and who knows how many PhD dissertations and students and stuff away from figuring this one out. But I suspect that, a certain percentage of that animalistic piece is rooted in biology and is probably unchangeable. But then wrapped around that, you really have the conditioning and the belief system stuff that's associated with those underlying processes over time and whatever else. And those can be radically different across people. There's a power that being able to access the celestial seems to bring to sort of cleaning up, if you will, that animalistic system. And I think that's very helpful from both sides of the fence. It's very helpful if you grew up on the animalistic side or the base side of this whole equation, and you've got a bunch of stuff over there that you can then later access the celestial and get cleaned out. And as I mentioned, this feels like a different form of deconditioning. It's where you have people using words like light. It really does feel like almost like there's a light that you would describe in how this feels in your body as you can feel that deconditioning happening in different spots. One of the things that is also noticed is that it's often, let's say that, you've worked with conditioning in your body a lot and you're like, oh, I've always got this spot here and finally, it dissolved at location 4 or something, right? I don't feel it anymore. Or, oh, I've got this spot here. Or, you've got probably a map. If you've done physiological releasing for any period of time, you've got a map. I had a map for sure. I mean, I knew the major spots. I knew the minor spots. I knew what stuff basically related to, I've been working on that stuff for years, even well before the transition to fundamental well-being, just in personal growth, personal development circles, it's got a lot of the same stuff. So with the celestial layer, one thing that is noticed, I noticed it, is different spots seem to show up. Different spots seem to appear. And so it seems to be getting at different stuff in these various ways that you can perceive and how it feels like that body-based sort of deconditioning is happening in the different spots that are showing up as a result of that, all of that. Okay. Now on the other side, if someone grew up rooted in the celestial, and especially it matters a little bit if they grew up with a celestial ego or if they grew up in PNSE in the celestial. But either way, the celestial cuts off access to a lot of that animalistic piece if you're in it in a pure sense, right? Which means it cuts off a lot of access to this kind of normal human type processes, psychological and stuff processes that are going on. Obviously, that's going to bring its own, issues in terms of ability to gain intimacy with people and stuff like that. But beyond that, if you think about it, as you grow up rooted in that system, those parts of you are still active. They're still developing, but they're developing outside of self-referential awareness. They're developing outside of sort of the smoothing function that creates a coherent, sense of self with them as parts of it. There's a lot of disassociation. There's a lot of potential for dysfunction in those parts, and there's more or less no access to that to do much about it, right? And so that can be a significant issue. You can even have people growing up with kind of an internal demonization of the human from that standpoint, right? I mean, imagine you land in fundamental well-being, you grow up on the celestial side, you feel like an alien, you feel like people exist in this lower dimension than you, they seem crazy, basically to you, like you can't understand why they do the things they do, why there's the harm that there is in the world, because you've got all the goodness from the celestial side. It's like humanity is just this horrible thing in a way that you can't really understand or come to grips with. Imagine if that's your internal processing and you've got those parts in yourself and that's what they're listening to all the time is your subjective judgment of them, in effect, as the extension of your view of humanity and whatnot. That can also really mess things up potentially in there, right? And so it's for that reason that I think even if people are on the celestial side, it makes sense for them to gain some access to these animalistic processes because there's stuff there for the celestial to clean up as well. And they actually have an advantage. And that advantage is if they're very rooted in the celestial and they can get their awareness into some of those pieces and parts, by default, that cleaning, that purification process, or whatever you want to think about it, is going to happen. For the rest of us that came in on the animalistic side, if we didn't root very strongly in the celestial, such that it's kind of the dominant part of our experience in every moment, then we have to do a conscious bridging between these two pieces, right? And so we have to really sort of put our intent, our focus, our attention, really not intent, our intention in the celestial, right? And then simultaneously put some of our attention back in the animalistic process or whatever it is that we're trying to sort of get the celestial to bridge to and kind of clean up. And that is a very active process unless you are really dominantly rooted in the celestial and doing it from there. So I wanted to make that point really as clear as I could as well. I think that basically covers it. So thanks for your attention on this, and email support if you want with any questions, and I'll see you next time.